I would imagine growing up in a society that from the age of 10 you were told that you are a sexual being and you can't tempt men, it would be a little bit scary to kind of take off that mask and to present yourself in a way that's opening you up to the gaze of men that could potentially be dangerous. Did you feel that way at all?
Yeah. So I personally did not feel that way because my parents had a very different approach to that circus, if you will. So my parents didn't necessarily put that kind of pressure on me. They did not necessarily make me feel like I had to perform or go out there and be found. Not at all. My parents actually were not of the idea that women should get married very young, that definitely not marry our cousins because all of my cousins were marrying their cousins and all of my friends were marrying their cousins. So that was a line that my parents drew. So no cousin marriage, no getting married super young, fresh out of high school. So I didn't feel that pressure. That's not to say that during that time, from the age of 15, 16, people were not knocking on the door. Um, it sounds very conceited to say that, but that's just the cultural norm. That's just how they did things. It's like, okay, they're knocking on the door, and they don't necessarily want the marriage to happen right away, but they're like, oh, she's a catch. We're going to make sure that we can at least lock her in. And so I didn't feel that pressure because my parents didn't put that pressure on me. The pressure that I felt was in making a decision that would be the least of two evils, if you will. Evil is not necessarily the right word, but maybe it is. I felt the pressure and put the pressure upon myself to find that man that I was going to then allow to come knocking at my door, because he had to meet a standard that I had, which was he had to be modern. He had to be open-minded somewhat. He had to have, a somewhat similar approach to how my family views the world. I could not marry a traditional man that then expected me to just be, you know, barefoot and pregnant at home or at his service, just being the wife. So that's where I felt more of the pressure.
Okay. And how did you end up finding this man?
Well, yeah, so I do go into details in the book, but essentially a friend of mine who was also like me, mixed, her mom was British, her dad, Saudi, had a lot more of a freedom meeting guys and talking to guys. Her parents were a little more comfortable. My parents were definitely a little more reserved and traditional. And so she met this guy through family friends. I mean, again, it was like all the family, they met him, and he had just come back to Saudi Arabia after living in the US. His dad was a diplomat, his mom, both his parents Saudi. He was born in the US, and he grew up there till he was about 13. And now we're 16, 17. So he had just come back. And so when she met him, she was like, oh my gosh, I think this is the right person for Jasmin. Of course, when I met him, it was fine. I did not fall madly in love, but I thought to myself, this has to be the kind of man I have to end up with, because he kept saying he wanted to go back or he wanted to leave Saudi Arabia, and he didn't want a wifey and an obedient woman and like all the things. I was like, okay, this will be the right man for me. And so at 16, 17, I was like, okay, I guess this is it. And so for 3 years, we talked on the phone secretly. My mom knew, my brother knew, but my dad was, I didn't want to upset him. I don't know that he would have been upset, but I just, waited, because his biggest fear was that we would get married young for all the wrong reasons. And then we followed the trajectory of everyone else. His mom came and spoke to my mom. His dad came and officially proposed. We had our little formal engagement. We were chaperoned when we were together. We did the milka, that ownership ceremony where I wasn't even involved, but the men were. And it's hard because then there's the dowry involved. So it's almost like you're purchasing the girl. And my dad just did not like and conform to that. It was really hard for him. I was his first daughter getting married. And so I know it was emotional for him, but it had to be done. And so I stayed in that marriage for 6 years. We traveled a lot, but I knew I did not want to have a child with him because I knew he was probably not going to be the man that I was going to be with the rest of my life.
Mm.
And there was a lot of pressure to having a child because you're married now. His family wanted a grandchild, wanted nieces and nephews. And I just bought myself time, because if I had kids, I knew I would never be able to leave ever, ever, ever.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned in your book in detail about the ways in which the marriage slowly started to change and you didn't get the guy that you initially thought you were marrying.
Yeah, very much so. So the more time passed, the more we both matured, because we got married when I was 19 and he was 20. So children.
Hmm.
So as we both matured, I was becoming more radicalized in my feminist belief and in my own sense of self-worth. he was becoming more attached and more traditional. So we definitely drifted apart deeply and immensely, because he was now starting to feel a lot more committed to the lifestyle, a lot more attached. He was doing well with his work. He was, very close to his family. And meanwhile, I was like, this is just getting worse. And thinking to myself, I mean, at this point, what do I have to lose? What do I have to lose? I cannot be here. I cannot live this life. And so we did drift apart, and I forcefully, wanted a divorce. And then in the meantime, I started plotting my infamous escape. My idea was to move to Canada, essentially to be with one of my childhood friends who was also in the book, and just kind of run away and go to her and then figure things out. But while I was plotting this escape and while I was getting, my act together, I fell in love with an American man there. And that was beautiful, wonderful, and extremely difficult. And for all the reasons. First of all, because my family would have never ever been okay with me marrying a Western man. He was a lot older than me. He was not a Muslim. There are all these things, but at that point I was like, what do I have to lose? So I proceeded with my plan to leave, but then he became a part of that plan as well.
Yeah, and I want to get into how you were able to actually escape. First, I'm wondering, did your husband at the time know that you were kind of drifting away and plotting to leave?
So he and I talked a lot about leaving, period, whether it was to another Arab country that was a little more modern and progressive, or whether it was going back to the US, which is what he wanted. I didn't necessarily have an attachment to the US. I'd come to the US and visited with him, like we went to Disney World and New York, where he grew up. But not America was not necessarily my ultimate goal. Obviously, I was attached to Europe and to Italy, but I didn't care as long as we were leaving that, oppressive environment. Um, but again, as he got more comfortable in his job, and then his mom got really sick, and she was fine after that. But during that time, she really guilted him into, what if I die? I'm not going to see my grandkids. And it was like very dramatic, very, very typical, manipulative. And that really created a wedge between us. And, and the pressure of having a child. And I said, I flat out told him, if we had children, it would not be in this country. It would be in the West. I'm not going to have children here. I wouldn't do anything. And I said, I understand that, but I can't do that. And so that's how that marriage started falling apart. It was obvious to both of us. We just started to have very, very different goals. We recognized that we should have probably just dated and been probably girlfriend and boyfriend for a few years. A wonderful first relationship. He was a good man. He was a kind man. But our priorities had shifted completely. The way he envisioned his life was way more in alignment with the traditions and the culture. And he was also pretty religious, not to the extreme that he forced me to cover and, and abide by those really fundamental laws, but enough to where there was the expectation that I had to pray 5 times a day. There was the expectation that when we traveled to other Arab countries, I wore a hijab. Didn't have to cover my face or wear the cape, but I had to cover my hair so that I came across as a proper Muslim wife. That started to really feel very off from the original plan.